Life is full of surprises, some good, some bad, some horrible, and some that I would place in a column of being miraculous. One such miracle we celebrate today. It is miracle of Hanukkah, miracle of a light burning 7 days longer than it should have been by any measure of scientific rationalism. Many of us don't believe that it happened that way. We try to find different ways to explain the central message of Hanukkah. A few days ago, I saw a miracle with my own eyes. Of course, like the beauty, the miracles also in the eyes of beholder. But what I saw felt like a genuine miracle to me. I'll tell you about it and show it to you. No, I don't mean the visit to the United States of a Jew who incredibly happened to be a president of Ukraine, a country with a long history of mass murders of Jews by their Ukrainian neighbors. No, not the miracle of that Jewish, I bet only in the nominal sense Jewish, president of Ukraine, without whom the country would have long ago succumbed to Russian invaders as it did 8 years ago in Crimea. No, I'm talking about the miracle I observed the day before Zelensky arrived in the U.S. The miracle I'm talking about took place on the 26th of Kislev, a day in the year of 5783 on the Jewish calendar. Or put it differently, on December 20th of this year, a day before Zelensky arrived in the United States. The miracle occurred in the Ukraine city, which is between Kyiv and Odessa, a city of incredible history, a city where I was born. That city is called Vinnytsia. But before I show you this miracle, I need to tell you something that took place there more than 60 years ago. When we moved, that is my family, my father, mother, moved into a new house that my father built. It was nothing to brag about, but it was a much better place than our previous one-room habitation right next to a marketplace without bathroom, gas, stove, or even kitchen, where we lived in one room. It was only one room apartment, 5 people, my mother, father, I, little boy, my father's mother, and my mother's father. The room was part of the house confiscated from my grandmother Rivka's family. She was my mother's mother, who I had never met. She, along with her daughter-in-law and 2 of my little uncles, were led by Nazis and their Ukrainian collaborators into the forest, together with more than 300 other Jews of the town called Vakhnovka, right next to Vinnytsia, where they lived and were shot in May of 1942. My grandfather, with my grandmother's blessing, was able to flee from that death march and miraculously survived for me to be able to tell you about it. But that is another story. In any case, what happened in that house one morning, I was 5 or 6 years old then, was me waking up and discovering to my incredible amazement under my pillow several real coins, a few kopecks. But what amazing kopecks those kopecks were. Overjoyed by this discovery, I screamed, "Ma, see what I found!" My mother looked into my hand and in horror yelled at my grandma, my father's mother, who, because of the horrible case of arthritis, turned from previously beautiful woman into a hunchback, always sitting in her corner bed. "Why did you do it?" my mother screamed. "Who said that he needs this stuff?" To understand my mother's reaction to my discovering of coins under the pillow, I need to say a few words about what it meant to grow up Jewish in the Soviet Union. In Vinnytsia, like in most other cities, the government turned synagogues into concert halls and other places. They did allow religious Jews of Vinnytsia to have one synagogue. It was a falling apart little hut at the end of the ugly courtyard of dilapidated houses, side by side with a public toilet. Later on, I learned that this was where my grandmother would drag herself to on Saturdays, that is for Shabbat service, when she was able to do so. While all Jews in the Soviet Union knew we were Jewish, it was all in our domestic documents, and we could differentiate real easily Jews from non-Jews just by looking. Only very few of us knew what it meant to be Jewish. The school I attended was the same school my mother went to for several years before the Holocaust, which she miraculously survived. She was 15 in 1941, and on that day happened to be in the apartment of her already married sister when that sister grabbed her and dragged her on the bus organized by her non-Jewish husband's place of work, and without saying goodbye to their parents. A few days later, German troops entered Vinnytsia and created there Hitler's personal headquarters in the Eastern Front. The construction was accompanied by the slaughter of tens of thousands of captured Soviet troops, which were used in the process of building the headquarters. Among them were two of my uncles. In any case, the school my mother attended before the war was the same school that I went to after the war. Although initially the school was a Jewish public school, there were no private schools in the Soviet Union, meaning the school where the language of instruction was Yiddish. That's how it was in 1930s, 1920s, 1930s. But in the mid-1930s, it was turned into Russian school, meaning the primary language of instruction became Russian. The school was next to the Ukrainian school, where the primary language of instruction was Ukrainian, and there was wall separating these two schools. It was not only Stalin who did not want Jewish schools anymore. Many Jewish parents did not want them either. The numerous Jewish, so-called progressive teachers of those schools, in their desire to completely separate the idea of being Jewish from Judaism, taught children nothing but hatred toward the Jewish people. In any case, it was Russian school when I was going there, and nothing about the Jews there was ever taught. Not that we wanted it. I remember when my father and mother spoke Yiddish, so I would not understand what they were saying. It irritated me because I thought that the Russian language was the language to speak in this day and age. It's not that I was hiding that I was a Jew. When I heard anyone calling me or someone else Žid, meaning kaik, my fists would be allowed to continue that conversation. No, I was a Jew, but I, like most of my friends, thought Yiddish was a backward language, and Russian was the language of the future. It was similar to the Ukrainian language. Nobody spoke Ukrainian in Vinnytsia. Even ethnic Ukrainians didn't. You could hear the Ukrainian language spoken only during the classes of Ukrainian language and literature, or when you went to some store and saw people from the villages buying cheap bread for themselves and their pigs. In any case, my parents did not talk to me about what it means to be a Jew, and I guess my grandmother was put in her place by my mother at that time during that Hanukkah. This was the first and last time I got a gift of Hanukkah guilt. Only one lesson in Jewish history I remember overhearing. It happened in the 9th grade during the break between classes. I came out into the hall and saw 3 girls talking. One of them, Natasha Shilova, an ethnic Russian whose father was a pilot, was telling 2 Jewish girls, Angela Brint and Asa Cheskaya, that Jesus was one of the ancient Russian heroes and that Jews came from northern Italy. Sound to me pretty reasonable. We did look a little bit like Italians, and Russians were talking about Jesus sometimes, so I thought maybe it was something from Russian history. In any case, I felt Soviet at that time, and Marxism shaped my worldview. However, it was not what we were taught in school or heard on TV. My Marxism was a serious undertaking, as was my attachment to my Soviet motherland. It is precisely this attachment to this Soviet motherland and Marxism, combined with my inborn inability to lie to myself, that was the cause of problems to come. It was my faith in the stated ideals of the Soviet Union that made me send a letter to Brezhnev protesting the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. I was 14 years old at that time. The result of that letter writing was the arrival in Vinnytsia of a KGB major from Moscow. I didn't see him. He came to my mother's place of work, and I learned about this visit only when I saw my petrified, tear-eyed mother after I came home from school one day. "Who are you writing letters to?" she screamed at me, eyes full of tears. "Your father will come from work. He'll show you how to write letters." I didn't know what she was talking about. I forgot that I wrote that letter. That evening when my father came from work, I thought I would get it. But my father did not raise his arm. He only said, "When they will get through with you, you will beg for death." I guess he knew what he was talking about. Being what I am, the attempt by KGB to scare me through my parents did not stop me, but only made me more convinced that I was in the right. 2 years later, in the 10th grade, I sent letters, this time without a return address, to the Soviet leadership. I demanded the abolition of the one-party rule, found a way to print and distribute leaflets urging it, and started the underground organization, the Communist Prometheus, with 2 of my friends, to realize this demand. My father did not have a chance to learn about it. He died that spring at the age of 44 from a heart attack. A few months later, I was arrested by KGB and delivered to the mental hospital, where they started their insulin shock therapy. They would strap me to a metal bed and tell me that it was impossible, if I'd be normal, for a Soviet citizen to see things the way I saw them. They also reminded me that if they don't give me a shot of glucose on time, I may not be able to come out alive after these injections of insulin. I was lucky. For some reason, they let me out after 3 weeks. Still, KGB would pick me up again another 2 times around major Soviet holidays. I guess they were afraid that I would do something during those holidays. And then after my trip to Moscow to support dissidents on trial there, they forced me to leave the country after that by threatening my mother with my being dead. The first 13 years in exile were the hardest because while my body was here in the United States, my mind and soul were in the Soviet Union. Being a Marxist, I devoted all my abilities to trying to get the leftists in the United States to come out in support of the Soviet dissidents, in support of Soviet movement for democracy. That is why I was writing for the leftist in these times, weekly, and eventually became a political commentator on NPR's Morning Edition and syndicated columnist for several newspapers. When Gorbachev came to power and was about to come to the United States, I wrote a piece for New York Times saying that his perestroika and glasnost sounded good on paper, but it meant nothing to me, as I have not seen my mother for 13 years. A week later, New York Times called me saying that they had just received a call from the Soviet embassy telling them that the Soviet Union had never really stopped me from seeing my mother. As a result, in December of 1987, I got Soviet visa and went to see my mother. That certainly was a miracle. But this is not the Hanukkah miracle I'm about to tell you about. I loved seeing my mother, and my mother, who suffered so much because of me, really loved seeing me probably even more. Still, me being me, 2 weeks before my visa expired, I was picked up again by KGB and read to the decision of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR, which decided that I must leave the Soviet Union within 36 hours again. One of the things about the trip, I have to say, I'm probably the only person in history of the Soviet Union that was expelled from that country twice. One of the things about the trip that I recounted in my New York Times article was my visit to Vinnytsa's main library. In response to my question about why there is not a single book about Jews there, the librarian, looking astonished, told me that there was no point to it, as Jews would disappear soon anyway. She probably meant the Marxist vision of the communist future when Jews would no longer exist as people. They would just become part of other people's. However, what she might have also meant that given a pickup in Jewish immigration from the Soviet Union, Jews may disappear from Vinnytsia. In any case, that person, in one way, was right. From a city where before the Holocaust, from a city which was before the Holocaust almost 40% Jewish, and from the city where I lived when 15% of its residents were Jews. The last time I was in Vinnytsia a few years ago, there was only 2,000 or 3,000 Jews out of the population of 350,000. 0.1%, maybe less. After I was deported the second time, my mother became sick. As she was dying in a hospital, I was able to force once again the Soviet authorities here in Washington to change their mind and allow me to go to see her again. I spent with her 6 months, the last 6 months of her life. So what is the Hanukkah miracle that I promised to tell you about? Here it is. On December 20th, that is a few days ago, I tried to call one of my Vinnytsa's friends, who has been living now in Israel for a long time. However, instead of dialing his number on my WhatsApp, I dialed by accident a number in Vinnytsia. The number of someone who tried, obviously, to call me before, but whose number I did not recognize at that time and thus did not answer. This time, when I dialed this number accidentally, I saw a bearded Orthodox man in front of me who spoke in a bit of convoluted Russian. I asked him who he was, and he said that he was Rabbi Shaul Horovitz of the Chabad synagogue in Vinnytsia. I asked him how many people came to celebrate Hanukkah in his synagogue, and he said several hundred. I asked him about the Jewish school there, and he said that there was now 32 kids. Before the war, there were 75. He also sent me several photos and videos, which I will share with you. After decades of godless Soviet rule, after almost all Jews had left Vinnytsia, the Jewish life in Vinnytsia had been reborn. The city now has not one dilapidated synagogue, but 4 synagogues, all in good buildings. 4 synagogues, 1 Jewish school, several Jewish organizations to care for people there. This is the miracle that I learned about on the second day of this year's Hanukkah. The Jews of Vinnytsia have not disappeared, but are alive and kicking, using Zelensky's expression in Congress. This is my Hanukkah miracle for you.
Ми твій неземний, сильний, вічний, вірний, наш Отець святий. Знову й знову нас прощаєш, від негоди захищаєш, Ава, любий Отче. Ава, ми твій неземний, сильний, вічний, мирний, наш Отець святий. Знову й знову нас прощаєш, від негоди захищаєш, Ава, любий Отче, Ава, Ава, Ава.
Раз, почекай, чекай.